Welcome to part 2 of my trestle table build. In this video, I will cover how I built the table base and how I applied finish to the table. Stay tuned. So examining the base in my SketchUp design, it is a relatively simple structure. 2 eye-shaped legs joined by a stretcher. I did want to add a little more design to it, so I added a slight taper to the top and bottom support structure of the legs. I also decided to add an upper stretcher to the build that is not included in this SketchUp design. The lumber I am cutting up for the base had already been cut on one edge, surfaced on one face, and then ran through the planer to get my 2 faces coplanar when the top was made. At this point, I am cutting the pieces to rough length for the middle vertical section of the leg and for the upper and lower sections of the legs. I'm wanting these to be thicker than my original lumber stock, so I will be laminating the pieces together to get my desired thickness. After getting the pieces cut to rough length, I run the pieces through the table saw to get the boards to the rough width, leaving some excess on the boards. The boards are then coated in wood glue, spread to a nice thin coating with a cheap rubber roller I purchased for the task, and clamped together. I utilize a single set of parallel clamps to do multiple glue ups to save on the use of clamps. Once the glue had dried to my satisfaction and set up, I removed the glue ups from the clamps. As I left excess on my wood cuts, I then ran the boards through the joiner to remove the dried glue squeeze out to clean up the boards. Then I ran the boards through the planer to remove the glue from the other surface and to bring them to the desired final dimension. Back at the table saw, I cut the center pieces of the legs to the final width I wanted. Then I hopped over to the miter saw to cut the boards to the final lengths I needed. I am going to be adding adjustable leveling feet to the table base to allow for the table base to not rest directly on the floor and level as needed. To add those feet, I wanted to have them recessed, so I used the drill press and a Forstner bit to drill one large hole enough for the leveling feet and a deeper, smaller inner hole for the threaded section of the adjustable feet. This was added prior to tapering the wood piece so that the board is level when drilling. Unfortunately, I didn't video this, so I'll try and describe it to the best of my ability. To add the taper, I created a jig for the table saw. I figured out what degree of taper I wanted, then used a scrap piece of plywood, cut to an even width on the table saw, lined up my marks for the taper along the cutting edge of the plywood, then screwed in some smaller scraps to hold the board in place at that angle along the cutting edge. This allowed me to just place the other boards in place in the jig to repeat the cuts. I didn't have any at the time, but it would be safer if I had added some clamps to the jig to hold the boards in place when running through the table saw. You'll also note in the footage the domino holes I had cut in the middle sections prior to the taper cuts. I appear not to have that footage, so just note that those are easier to cut prior to cutting the tapers. Speaking of those domino holes, I didn't pay attention to how the jig would cut the shorter bottom portion of the legs, so where it meets up with the vertical part of the leg, my taper made it too narrow. My fix was to run it through the table saw to cut the board height by about 1/4 of an inch to where it would elongate the flat portion of the board to match the width of the vertical section of the leg. Here you'll see me using the domino to recut those domino holes to account for the depth being reduced by removing a portion of the board. This also lowered the table height by about 1/4 of an inch, but since the client, me, didn't mind, I didn't have to redo the 2 bottom pieces of the legs. Before I started the glue up, I'm doing a dry fit of the pieces. You'll see here how I cut the domino holes for the legs. I used the Domino XL to cut 4 domino holes in the top and bottom section of the legs to accommodate a 12mm by 100mm domino. I measured to make sure I was okay with the overall height and fit, and then proceeded to glue up. The glue up is pretty basic. Apply glue to the dominoes, and then apply glue to the wood surface of each end of the vertical portion of the leg, and clamp up. Remove any excess glue squeeze out. Once the glue was dried and set, I removed the legs from the clamps and sanded them. You'll also see here the 2 stretchers I'll be using in the build. They got a sanding as well. Each of the stretchers I cut domino holes in the ends. The bottom stretcher was wide enough to get 2 dominoes. The upper stretcher received 1. To place the domino holes in the legs for the stretchers, since I didn't have an edge to reference, I utilized the reference points on the domino to line up the domino to drill the holes. I started by finding the center point on the legs. Then I marked the crossing center point lines for the dominoes and the stretchers. On the domino there is a reference line on the base plate face for the center, and on the edges of the base plate are reference lines for the center of the bit. I lined those up with the reference lines I had drawn, then cut the domino holes. Afterwards, I did a dry fit to make sure everything lined up as desired. I wanted to add a chamfer to the table leg edges, so I took the time at this point to add those with the trim router. The corners are skipped to clean up with the chisel in the next step. In the corners, I used a straight edge to draw my reference lines for my chisel cleanup. Then I proceeded to further try and increase my chisel talent skills from basically none to something I don't cringe at when I'm looking at my handiwork in the future. Since there are 16 of these corners, I got a good amount of practice to get better at it. Now was the fun part of gluing it all together. I used some pipe clamps to hold it together since I didn't have any parallel clamps long enough to do so. Also clean up any glue squeeze out. And some further sanding. Also some sanding by hand of the chamfered edges. Before applying finish, I put in the hardware for the leveling feet. I figured this would allow me to apply finish to the bottom of the base, then add the leveling feet, flip the table base, and continue applying finish without the bottom resting on a surface. I'm going to be using these Z-clips to attach the tabletop. Here I'm marking out the location for the clips. I may have went a little overboard with the number of clips I used. I added the holes for those by using the 4mm bit on the domino with the loose setting to allow for wood movement. You can also use a biscuit joiner if you have one of those as well. And now on to applying the finish. I used Rubio Monocoat charcoal with accelerator for the table finish. This is my first time using Rubio Monocoat, and since the surface of the table was rather large, I figured I'd start by doing half of it so I'm not working on too large of a surface before it gets too tacky. I spread out the Rubio Monocoat using a plastic squeegee and then used a white Scotch-Brite pad to rub it into the grain. Be sure to remove your pouring cup from the table before you start shaking around so it doesn't spill like mine did. Then when it had the time to dry, I used some white shop paper towels to remove the excess. Then proceeded to do the same on the other half of the table and the edges. I gave it a good 24 hours for that side to cure, then flipped the table over and proceeded to do the same on the other side of the tabletop. For the base, I decided to try using a foam brush to apply the Rubio Monocoat. It did okay for the application. I may have to try other applicators in the future. Also, I used the white Scotch-Brite pad to work into the grain and remove the excess with white shop paper towels. Please remember to properly dispose of the paper towels and anything with the Rubio Monocoat on it, as it can spontaneously combust if not properly disposed of, and that's a very bad thing. Lastly, the Z-clips were used to attach the table base to the top. And here's the final product in its new home space. I'm quite happy with how the overall piece came out. It's a quite solid build and should last for many years to come. Thanks for watching.